we just see more parity in terms of purchase price and then deal terms. And I think that's healthy for the market. I would not say, in my experience, it's a buyer's market. Right. I think right now it is just a normal, there's full parity market. And if you have a good business, it sells on terms that have acceptable risk to you. Now, what's ahead? We'll see what 2025 brings.
Have you ever wondered what makes some companies grow while others plateau or fade away? Or what makes an inspirational leader versus someone who teams dread working for? On this podcast, the executive team at Thinc Strategy chat with business leaders who share their lessons and journeys, their strategies on growth and leadership, and how they're continuously thinking ahead. On today's episode, Thinc Strategy's Karen Albritton welcomes attorney Deana Labriola, partner at Fox Rothschild. Deana is an experienced corporate transactional attorney who centers her practice on mergers, acquisitions, and debt and equity financing deals. She routinely serves as lead counsel to sellers and buyers in connection with the sale of operating companies to or on behalf of strategic purchasers, private equity investors, and management/owner teams. Here's Thinc Strategy advisor, Karen Albritton.
Well, now, when you're working with a business owner, either a family or a CEO, and they start to talk with you and they say, hey, at some point we envision a transaction. We envision selling this business. It's not going to be, or maybe it is to a second generation, but what type of advice do you give them?
So certainly what we need to do is we need to understand the financial goals first. Those might not drive the decision, and that's a conversation as well. But we do need to understand the financial goals and whether the company is currently meeting them or that's, anticipated growth. So but beyond that, which is a natural conversation any attorney is going to have, I think then the question is, what is largely important to you as an owner? And I'm not sure that folks have always necessarily been asked it in that way. Mm-hmm. And so part of that is thinking, is this more about legacy for you? So let's assume whatever nest egg you feel you need, or whether you want to work again. Maybe that's a consideration. Yeah. But whatever income piece of it will be met. What's the why beyond that? So that could mean a nest egg for your children. That could mean a legacy or a cultural fit, either for your employees, for your clients, depends on the business. Mm-hmm. And it could mean that you want to make sure that the buyer is, perhaps an employee or perhaps a strategic. There might be some reason you want to see this product you've developed grow and flourish.
Right.
So every owner and or management team has different goals in mind. So I think that's the kind of next step of, okay, what are we doing? Then we build what we're doing around that. And so that can come in a lot of different forms, right? I would say first and foremost, there's a couple of prescriptive things you would do to sort of position a company for sale. Mm-hmm. One, look at your financials.
Yeah.
Are they in order? What I say is there anything in what I've found, and this is in bigger businesses than you would think. Sometimes that they do unusual things on their financials. Or, for example, there's a loan that wasn't booked as a loan, but we've been paying this expense.
Yeah.
And do we need to course correct? We know we perhaps have a state tax filing that we should have filed in 2021 and we just never got around to it. I mean, there are things that exist in the business, right? So taking care of the financial health of your company. But then are there any real gaps or holes that you think, or are there people that you believe are going to be necessary or that you want to take care of in the transaction? Start thinking through those discussions, because that's the kind of thing you're setting up in advance of, your healthy financials. And then to the extent you want to start interviewing advisors if you don't believe you have the team already built.
Right, because I'm sure you come into some of these situations and they may not be ready, or maybe down the road, and you may say, hey, you need to put together a team, right? When you're thinking about that team, what type of folks do you normally recommend they reach out to?
So I think there's a couple of teams, some of which they may already have and some of which they may not. But even if they already have the advisor, they really need to sort of vet the experience of the advisor, depending on how small or big they are.
Yeah.
So the first is, do they have a CPA? I think that most buyers are, whether strategic or not, they're going to look at the financials and say, are the financials accurate? Are they complete? Were they prepared competently? And one way to show that is to have a CPA with knowledge. Now, that same person may or may not have acquisition knowledge. And so that's the important distinction, right? So as you're putting together the team, if you're with a CPA firm, it could perhaps be your accountant, but it may not be. Maybe somebody else within the firm. So that's kind of the first, vetting that team of, is the person who does the taxes the same as who would advise you through a transaction? And if not, vet that out early.
Yeah.
The second is a financial advisor. If you're a seller, I mean, although I do represent buyers and sellers, if you're a seller, you hopefully are going to be getting a big stream of cash, or at least a big event. This is a big event that's going to happen. You're going to get a lot of cash at once. Well, how do you deploy it in the most tax efficient manner, in a way that suits your long-term goals? And so bringing not only that CPA to the table, but of course then the financial advisor who may have those larger long-term retirement goals in play. So that's the other. And then legal is, I would suggest that if you do have a regular attorney that advises the business, reach out to them, because they would be in at least the best position to at least have an initial conversation. But ask the same questions as you would as a CPA. Do they have sale experience? If not, does somebody else that they work with do? And understand that you're going to be living with this person, for all of these folks, for a long time. So make sure you like them.
Exactly.
And then one other one, which not every business has, but I'll mention it, is either an investment banker, depending on the size of the business, or a business broker. Someone, you can think of it as sort of a real estate agent. I'm not likening them to real estate agents, but they are sort of the real estate agent of the business world. So they regularly sell businesses, and or some buy as well, and help broker the deal.
Right, because there may be, you may not have a buyer that's readily apparent.
Correct.
You may need to
market it.
the
just like you would on the MLS, your home.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's shocking. I always compared a home sale to a business sale, but that's the way that a lot of folks understand it.
Well, and it's a very major transaction for most people if it's privately held. You mentioned the be prepared to like these people and work with them, because there's a lot that goes into it. It's a lot more than a normal transaction. If someone says, I want to sell my business, how long?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, okay, so I'll first start with the lawyer answer. The lawyer answer is it depends. And but what I try and give folks is a range when they ask, because I get that question. Usually 3 to 6 months, but that has a lot of variables in it. And the variables will depend as the deal constructs or deconstructs, depending on your viewpoint. And so there might be things that naturally come out of the due diligence phase. So one of the first things you'll do is whether you market the business to buyers, to a swath of buyers, or if you just simply have a strategic in mind, so you're negotiating with one buyer, you'll eventually get that number down to one. The process might take a little longer. It might take a couple months if you're marketing the business and then getting multiple offers, just like you would on a home. Or if you know who you're going to sell it to, it's certainly a quicker process at the start. But assuming you get to the same point, which is now you have an offer letter, right? You have a letter of intent, and that lists the relevant terms. It also generally lists a due diligence period, which can often be about 2 months, let's just say for round numbers. That is when the buyer's going to look under the hood and is really going to take a look at everything in your business. Now, depending on what it finds, could lengthen up that process. So there may be a number of things it finds in the business that we need to address, either real time or that may take some time to address. There may be employee issues. There may be tax liability issues. We may not have, registered to do business in a state, and we should have. Some of those things are very quick, or we may not have a renewed agreement with a major customer, and the buyer won't feel good moving forward without it. So there's just a number of things that could happen that then rely on something else happening. And that can take that timing out. And then there's just good old-fashioned renegotiation. If we find something, if buyer finds something that it either doesn't like or thinks should impact the purchase price, there's some time that it takes to renegotiate things or to, differently negotiate things.
So it depends. It can be a lot longer.
Certainly. And it can be up to a year or more. Sure. And then there's some timing considerations, if your business is seasonal.
Yeah.
You may not want to, if the purchase price hinges on some growth that, some client coming through with X number of dollars within a time period, you didn't hit it, but you think you'll hit it in the next 3 months. Could hinge on that. So I'd say 3 to 6 months is general deal terms. But again, lots of impact.
So let me turn the tables just a little bit. We've talked a lot about it from the seller perspective, but from the buyer perspective, if you're a privately held business and you're looking to grow through acquisition, what are some of the things that you advise them to be on the lookout for in that type of environment?
So it depends on who you're buying from, of course. But some of the items from a buy side perspective is you would want to make sure if it's a regulated industry in some way, then what we would want to make sure is that everybody is properly licensed by whatever body needs to license. So that's kind of first and foremost. Make sure you have your regulatory house in order if you are a highly regulated business or even just a moderately regulated business. Think about like general contractors or professional engineers. I mean, if there are folks that need to have certain licenses to operate, and it won't make sense to acquire those folks if that process will be difficult in some way.
Exactly.
So that's certainly one thing that is, from a buy side, you're going to be looking at pretty hard. The next is, I think there's just you have to look at how deep is the customer relationship. Obviously, that's going to impact how much you grow and how you grow. And other than a small, I would say there might be some other reasons beyond just bottom line that a company, a buying company may acquire a competitor in the industry or a strategic buy. Mostly it's to increase its bottom line. So it's really understanding how deep are those relationships. Will they come over to a new buyer? Will the client accept the new buyer? And if the answer is maybe, then we would want to make sure that we either lock up the employees that currently work on those from the seller side to remain as their point of contact, as the client's point of contact, or put in some other fix.
Yeah.
So it's really about thinking about your client base. That would be, it's depending on the business. And then obviously if there's a product, there's a widget that that a company makes, making sure that company owns that widget. So one thing we found, and this is particularly true in the intellectual property space, you may have had a contractor that developed something. You had a handshake that the company had a handshake deal with. Developed a great product that's now turned into something that a buyer wants to buy. And buyer says, well, what is the document that turns that over to me? Because it wasn't an employee that developed it, and that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
So there are things that come up that if you're on the buyer side, it's going to depend on the product or service being provided and then how you can, in your goals for the acquisition.
So just making sure that every single element of the acquisition and what you're acquiring, that you're sure that is going to transition to you when you own it.
Correct. And if it's not, then the documents are allocating risk in the appropriate way to account for whatever the deficit is.
Yeah. And then that just comes down to negotiation
Correct.
at that point.
Correct. Yeah.
At
And
that
there's no
point.
formula that's why I love it, because every deal, buy side or sell side, is its own animal. Even if on paper it's fairly prescriptive and vanilla,
Yeah.
it's its own animal inside of the transaction, because it's got a lot of personalities at the table beyond the lawyers. It also just has a number of peculiarities. Maybe that's not the right word, but certainly nuances that are specific to it and it alone.
Right. No two deals are the same.
Never.
No two deals are the same. Well, we've talked about buy side, sell side, and sometimes they'll say, boy, it's a buyer's market. Sometimes you'll say it's a seller's market. I guess I would just ask you now, are you seeing any trends, or is there anything, are there new things in the M&A landscape today?
So let's sort of go to pre-2023 or 2023 and sort of the 4 or 5 years before.
Right.
I mean, what was happening in the market was money was cheap and money was available, right? I mean, just lending was at, an all-time high. Why? Because we probably all either considered or did refinance our home to some crazy, to some crazy interest rate. Yeah. Well, that was happening in the business world too. So what ended up happening, because money was cheap, is I think buyers felt that they could take some calculated risk. And they ended up, because they had to in order to get a business, because businesses were being outbid, particularly good businesses, everything and anything sold in the sort of pre-2023 era.
Yeah.
And everything sold for a really high price and on really favorable terms to sellers. I mean, to say it was a seller's market, now, of course, 20 plus years, I've seen some seller's markets, but this was nothing like I've ever seen. So the terms were crazy and good for sellers. I mean, there was a number of sellers that exited right time. Great. What I would say now, given that history, is now that interest rates have, of course, corrected, what I find now is we're in a more normal market. And so there's more parity. And that's probably good for the market, certainly because the market couldn't sustain itself at what it was. And I was shocked that it sustained itself for a very long time. But what we see now is a better, or maybe a more fair, between buyer and seller allocation of risk within the documents. So that can either mean purchase prices coming down or purchase prices shifted differently. So meaning that we might get a little less purchase price up front, a little more that's contingent on future growth. Gotcha. It's a pretty common format.
Exactly.
Or we shift certain liabilities within the documents more towards seller, you keep this, and if nothing happens, then great. But we're not going to take the risk. Buyer takes the risk. So we just see more parity in terms of purchase price and then deal terms. And I think that's healthy for the market. I would not say, in my experience, is a buyer's market. Right. I think right now it is just a normal, there's full parity market. And if you have a good business, it sells on terms that have acceptable risk to you. Now, what's ahead? We'll see what 2025 brings. That's deal terms, deal scope, and deal price. In terms of trends, now, of course, I'm just anecdotally looking at my own.
Right.
Deal flow in the lower and middle market for good operating companies has not slowed down. I have a pipeline of buys and sells, at least in my own experience. I'm not experiencing any softness in the market. I have heard that others are, and that is somewhat regional, but not really. We'll see what 2025 brings.
So let me ask you one follow-up question on that, maybe one, maybe two.
Sure.
But in terms of that deal flow, how much of this is also influenced in part by the demographics of our market and our world now? I mean, have all these businesses that are owned by boomers or led by boomers, and they're looking at maybe doing something else,
Sure. Well, so I think it's twofold. I would say that most of them got out. And most of them got out, certainly 2019, 2020.
Yeah.
But really when COVID hit, I think there were a number of folks that just said, for a number of different reasons, I'm out. I was, and so I do believe that we're probably going to have less on the market just from that generation because a number of them got out. Now, what we are going to see though is there's a number of private money, because money was cheap, that went into these businesses. So what I'm looking for is what's the next exit from those. So thinking about venture fund, venture capital investments and or private equity investments, they've invested in funds, in businesses during that time period, during the last, let's say, 6 years. Well, the time horizon for them to get out is about now.
Yeah.
Or will be upcoming.
2025, 2026.
Right.
Those
exactly.
2019,
That's
2020, that 2021, that COVID transition is going to come up, and they're going to be looking at
So for me, this might be the deal flow that's just the natural extension of the private money that came in and flooded the market during those times. We'll see. We'll see if I'm right. And then of course you have an entire generation, I think, of entrepreneurs that have that are exiting sooner. And so we do have generations that are selling at, folks are selling at 40 and maybe willing or in their 30s and maybe willing to live on less for the rest of their lifetime to have a better lifestyle. And they might have had it right all the time. We don't,
we don't
life
know.
will see. What time will tell.
Yeah.
But I do think that there's that generation as well. And that's certainly a sweeping generalization, but I do see a lot more exits younger.
Interesting. Younger exits. And they may be serial. They may be saying, I'm going to do this
right.
and I'm not going to just do this one business.
Right.
I want to do multiple things.
Or they may decide that 5 years from now.
Exactly.
They get the bug.
Get back in it.
Right.
Well, one final question. We've just been, I think, looking ahead, and I wonder, how do you prepare? Or how do you help your clients, and how do you personally think ahead?
It's such a fascinating question to me. Thank you for asking it first. So one of the things I do, it's likely not personal to me. I'm certain most attorneys or some attorneys do it. I talk to, because I represent usually a closely held business on the sell side. So I'm just talking at this point on the sell side. And it's usually, sometimes it's a founder, sometimes it's a family, but there's clearly a psychological connection to the business. This isn't just something they run. This is their baby, right? So when I get engaged or have an initial meeting with that person or that group of managers or management folks or shareholders, whatever the case may be, that closely held group, I ask them to think about the day after closing. And I said, what do you want that day to look like? And they've never been asked that. Typically, and they've not thought about it either. They've thought about the transaction, and they've thought about the 6 years ahead in the transaction, or maybe even the 30 years ahead, depending on the time horizon. Right? How do I take care of my family? How do I make this generational wealth? Whatever the calculus may be. They don't ever think about the day after closing. Do they want to walk into that same place, not the boss anymore?
Yeah.
Could they really psychologically think about just being out, not instinctually getting in their vehicle or their bike, however they get to work, and getting to work that next day? So depending on what that answer is, and sometimes it comes in the meeting and sometimes I have to think about it, we work backwards from there. So when we think ahead, I always like to think ahead to that day after closing, because I think that that's a way that we frame the entire sales process. It drives all the decisions in between.
That's fantastic, and I appreciate your saying that so much. We, as you know, at Thinc, we work with some owners who go through that process, and we have been talking. You know, we talk to them about that, and want to know, well, what will wind up being giving you that sort of happiness. We talked about happiness early before we started, that at the end of this. And then, let's see what the business needs to do, what the process needs to do, but it comes back to, again, that personal piece of this and what is gonna give you fulfillment out of this process. So that is a wonderful, wonderful way to help your clients think ahead. So Deana, thank you for doing this. You share some really great advice, and I know our listeners are going to appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Think Ahead. We hope you've gained some valuable insight and inspiration to propel your business forward. Remember, success is not a destination but a journey, and Think Strategy is here to help you every step of the way. Visit thinkstrategy.com. That's THINC strategy.com for more info. And for more of this podcast, press the follow button and share with your network. This podcast is edited and produced by Earfluence. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon on Think Ahead.